planned for the start of the year have been derailed. There's this thing that we all know called the COVID pandemic, and even the most agile of workplaces have had to adapt, like newsrooms. And that's forced us to reassess the way that we do business. Joining me are Zane Seymour, the managing editor of Newsroom Africa, Rob Rose, the editor of Financial Mail, Glatzi Maglatzi, the editor-in-chief of Eyewitness News and the current chair of SANEF, the South African National Editors Forum. Things are not the same in the newsroom as the way it used to be. And one of the things that have come up, it's the safety of, actual physical safety of journalists. Maglatzi, you've got a big newsroom and compared to other newsrooms. What are you doing to make sure that journalists are actually safe?
Thank you very much, Lance. I wish I had a big newsroom, but I think all of us as editor-in-chiefs can do with a little bit more people in the newsroom. Obviously, the first thing was, as COVID hit then in March, was how do we respond as a newsroom? And as you're saying, the most important thing was keeping our journalists safe. The first thing was getting them ready to work from home, which is a challenge in itself because newsrooms are usually places where we share on the energy, the excitement, breaking news stories, somebody screaming an angle, shouting out, and we had to lose out on that because we had journalists having to then work from home. And then the second issue had to be, we still need stories to be covered, but we also need to think about whether our journalists should actually go there. And we know that there's been a lot of changes just in terms of how press conferences are done, where a lot of them are happening virtually. Parliament right now is also happening virtually, but there are stories that journalists still need to go out. If you need to be able to tell the South African story, tell the story of how an informal settlement is battling with social distancing, or what is the impact of not working and people not being able to access to go to work and have money to buy food, you still need reporters to go out. And we've had to just make sure that they have personal protective equipment and also ensure that while they're doing their interviews, keep their distance. That has been also quite critical, and it's a message that we've had to reinforce every single day, because it's very easy for our reporters to just quickly go back to the way we are used to doing stories. Radio is a very intimate medium. It's a medium where you want to sit down with somebody and be very close to them. But we've had to remind them that in this fighting this pandemic and keeping them safe, they have to keep that distance. And we've also seen television channels also having to change, not having, guests inside of our studios and having to do these interviews with the people from home. So the newsroom has had to change, and I think while we are keeping our reporters safe, there are just things that you do miss, that energy, vibrancy, the shouting in the newsroom. We've really lost that.
Zane, don't you find that is there a common standard for safety? For example, is there a set regulation saying when a journalist comes into work, these are the steps that he or she must follow? Do you have those kind of protocols? Zane,
I mean, we have standard. Yeah, I don't think that there's a standard protocol that is being developed across the settlement. I think we kind of all media newsrooms have adapted as best they can, both from a personal perspective in terms of protection for reporters, but also in terms of what you do in the workspace. So at Newsroom Africa, for instance, one of the more immediate things we did was to change up our newsrooms in terms of creating one walkway corridors. We rearranged our seating plans so that people don't sit next to or opposite each other. We're sitting in zigzag formation. The rest of the newsroom where you can't walk or are not allowed to, like the lifts and so on, look like a crime scene because it's cordoned off with the red tape, right? And then you obviously have all the precautions in terms of when reporters go out, the sanitizers, the gloves, the constant reminders of being safe. And when they come back to the office, the same procedure, the temperature being taken, the sanitizing. But it's still difficult. as you know, newsroom communal spaces. In television newsrooms, it's a bit more difficult because you have edit suites. In essence, television is such a collective process that you can't do it on your own. In radio, you can go into an audio booth and cut your piece and it's ready in whenever you are. But with television, you're going to need to go to your sub. You're going to need to go to the editor. So the opportunities for risk are a lot more, and we've had to really be innovative about what we do and how we do it. And I think we're learning as we go along. We are adapting, much like government, the regulations and the processes as we uncover them, because we are still in kind of the maelstrom of COVID, and we're learning what is necessary and the pitfalls and they are at the moment. But at the same time, I would like to just take it a little bit further. And when you talk about safety of reporters, it's also the mental well-being of reporters. And we've had placed a huge focus on that by having wellness programs introduced in the newsrooms, where you have the availability and access to speak to someone outside of the newsroom, obviously, about your experiences. And then also we've had to come up with very strict rosters. So our main aim in the newsroom at the moment is to reduce the numbers that we have at any given point in the newsroom. So in terms of that, we've had to adjust what we call lockdown rosters. So we've put people on different rotations. We've put some people on longer hours, but less days, you know, all in an attempt to have lesser people in the newsroom at any given point. So those were some of the initial kind of precautions and measures that we had to quickly take and quickly adapt to when we were faced with this pandemic. But in as far as a standard set of rules, no. We're basically refreshing and innovating as we go along.
So, Rob, you seem to have gotten the easier ride compared to the broadcasters, if I'm not mistaken. Your reporters are all that they don't have to report. Have you actually noticed a difference in the output of your product when coming to seeing that you don't have to have a physical newsroom?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you don't need it to some extent, but it's like Mhlatsi said, you do want to have the interaction. You do want people to be able to bounce ideas. And I think that that's a very important part of it. For example, you'll read a affidavit and you'll think, well, what does this mean? So part of the news gathering process and you know, way in which you get to the bottom of something is to chat about it with somebody, you know, chat about it with your editors. And I think if you don't have that, it makes the journalist less confident. It is very difficult. I mean, a print product, theoretically, you should be able to produce, you know, from wherever. But you still, you know, part of the journalism process is having, you know, witnessing things, you know, writing what's actually happening. And people are now not so willing to either be interviewed in person and it's very difficult for journalists to get out and describe what's happening. So I think it's created a certain degree of difficulty in producing eyewitness reports, which is common to broadcast media and print media.
I remember my days in a newsroom, and one of the things that we found is that whatever makes a good story is that when there's more robust debate. And so that robust debate has been taken out. So it's a second layer of eyes. It's a second layer of examining of the facts and the discourse that takes place within the newsroom. That's been removed now. So doesn't that mean that things are getting through under less scrutiny? There's no pushback from a sub, there's no pushback from an editor, or there is pushback, but there's no pushback from a colleague. There's no second set of eyes. Is that a big danger?
I do think that's been, you know, we've had 10, 15 years to adjust to that because we've had smaller and smaller newsrooms over that time. So there has been less scrutiny. There has been a diminishing sense of, you know, debate over a story. But the difficulty, I think, is if in a newsroom, you're sitting over here, you can ask the reporter to come there, you talk about a story, you refine stuff. The way it's working now is a lot of journalists are emailing copy through it just before deadline, and there's no real chance to massage things. There's no real chance to say, did you miss this? Did you look at this? What about speaking to this guy? I think the level of interaction to produce a better product is what's needed. And it's trickier. It is trickier. I mean, I think some people quite like this period of time. It might be easier to get hold of people. It might certainly improve productivity not to have to go and meet somebody for 2 hours, just talk to them on Zoom, for example. But I do think you lose something in the process. I think,
So I just want to remind anybody who's viewing it, you can look at it. You can also view it on facebook.com/gravitas.za. You can view it there. And if you'd like to chat or post questions, you can go to the chat, and you're welcome to take your questions. The issue, what you guys raised at press conferences, I think Mokglatsi, you raised that at press conferences. You said that we have to do press conferences differently. I found that at press conferences, you also get a lot of gossip, and the gossip leads to a lot of context, a lot of where things take place. So it's that off the record kind of chat that you have with the principal who's going to give you a context. Don't you find you lose that now? That kind of lead stories that sniff, don't you find you're losing that?
No, that's true. I mean, in some of the best stories that one has covered, it's in those long conversations that you have with newsmakers that you really get to the story. It's not easy. It's not that it was in the first 5 minutes that somebody gives you a story. It's that long conversation of asking the questions very differently. The current setup of press conferences as it is also equally problematic because you don't have direct access to the newsmakers. You're not sitting in the same room with them. And I find that sometimes those that are taking the questions that are being posed in the chat groups, sometimes they filter them. They ask the questions that they want to ask. And then sometimes even the newsmakers themselves can ignore your question, and you don't have the ability to say to them in the room, but I asked this question and you are not answering it. So that also just takes away from us being able to hold those in power accountable the way we would like to actually do it. There's a power of the doorstep. I think all of us know that some of the best stories have come out of a doorstep that they have from a press conference situation. That has also disappeared, where you're not able to physically stand there and then put your question to the newsmaker. So this new way of doing things is quite tricky. And I think, as Zane was saying, yes, we are learning as we go, but as Rob was also saying, we are losing some of the core things that make journalism or that make holding those in authority accountable possible, because Zoom has limitations. People can choose who they're answering from. I mean, you look at something like right now, as the South African National Editors Forum, we have asked the president that every time he addresses the nation, we should be able to ask him questions afterwards. That has not happened. But the president stands, makes his address, and leaves. Or we don't, and that's just part of the challenges of how, we are having to do news very differently. I certainly do miss the old way of doing things. I know there are people who are thriving in these situations where they think productivity levels are quite higher, but I think there is, in essence, we are losing some of the core things that makes journalism journalism.
Rob, you wanted to come in there?
I just want to say, I mean, I think Mokglatsi is exactly right. You look at Ramaphosa, for example, the president. I mean, the interaction you have is broadcast on TV. There's no interaction. Compare that to Donald Trump. Dare we bring the name Donald Trump as anything? He's obviously a terrible human being. We can all agree on that. But he sits there, and people can interact with him. He can answer questions, and they're able to confront him and tackle him on issues. But not having the debates, letting politicians not answer questions and discuss these issues and be tested on it is very difficult, especially in a situation where we've got one of the harshest lockdowns in the world and some of the most ridiculous rules. This is exactly the time where they need to be accountable, and the format of journalism now makes it more difficult than ever to hold people accountable.
Zane, you
just to add to that, Lance, in television, obviously, because we work with visuals and it's a visual medium, that problem is compounded. So we don't have that interaction. And like Mokglatsi said, sometimes the best stories are told through your pictures. And if you, to use the example of Donald Trump, Rob, is you can see. You don't have to sometimes listen to what he says. You just have to watch the body language. And those are some of the nuances that we are losing. And I want to just add to this issue of accountability, that that government and business and newsmakers are having an easy ride because we are not able to do our due diligence in terms of questions, and the government is very effective at the moment at filtering the kind of questions that they want to answer and how they answer and when they answer them. So definitely challenges for us beyond COVID-19 in terms of holding government and people in power to account.
We've seen that the COVID-19 has brought on a lot of issues, brought a lot of issues to the head. There are a lot of things in the media that was taking place. Rob, you've alluded, and Zane, you've alluded to it, that there was a shrinking of newsrooms, the advocacy of digital versus the old analog broadcasting, the now increasing impact of social media, and specifically that people broader public has gone distrustful of the media. Has COVID not accelerated these kind of issues and brought them to the fore when these things were just milling in the background? Is that so? Not so, Rob? Your mic's off now.
Sorry, I think there's been a determined effort by people who don't want to be held account to sow discord and present the media as untrustworthy. We talked of Trump earlier. We talked of several politicians who don't like being held to account. So they'll obviously do their best to say this is fake news. The amount of times that Donald Trump calls CNN fake news, it's not helpful towards anyone. And it's because he specifically doesn't like being held to account for the facts that he tends to present. So I think that there's been a far greater diversity of voices. And a lot of these voices have their own agendas, and part of it is that they rely on undermining the media. But equally, we have got many digital channels that we never used to have, so there are multiple voices. But you look at, COVID, for example, has spawned a whole lot of absolutely nuts conspiracy theories. And, you talk about these conspiracy theories and you say you can have Africa Check, which is fantastic, and says this is not true for this many these facts. But people will choose not to believe it because it doesn't fit into their echo chamber. So it's, you have to present the news in a way that is through reputable platforms that have made their name by telling you the truth, but people can choose to believe it or not, and that's what's happening. You have politicians that are actively undermining this.
Mokgadi, don't you have to constantly wage the war for credibility as well? Because this is the thing where some of our colleagues in the media haven't done the industry a whole lot of credit when they become players in it. Shouldn't media houses also be pushing back and saying you cannot be a player at the same time as being where you have these close personal relationships with politicians? You can't hold them to account when you have a relationship with them.
I think, Lance, maybe before I answer that, let's go back a little bit in terms of South African situation, right? So we do know, yes, trust levels between the public and the media have been in a state of decline, but it is not just because the media has gotten things wrong. There has been some well-funded campaigns to discredit the media. We should never forget Bell Pottinger and what Bell Pottinger did. And then also you can go to Twitter, and we know that there was a very long, sustained, very well-funded campaign to label certain journalists certain things just so that we can discredit them. We've seen the sexualization of reporters, especially female reporters, because they've reported critically on the Guptas or critically on the ANC or even the EFF in recent times. So, and we've seen now in South Africa where politicians who are caught with their hands in the cookie jar, their first reaction is to label journalists Stratcom. And that is a very well-designed campaign to discredit the media. White monopoly capital has been a word that has stayed with us since the Bell Pottinger campaign, and people have consistently and continue to use it as they try to discredit the media. And most of the time, the people discrediting the media are the people themselves who are found wanting, who have questions who have to answer in terms of their spend of public funds or even their unethical behavior. So it is not out of out of context. But we still think that, and it's something that us as the media have to continuously push back. And we push back by, again, highlighting and singling out those politicians when they label the media certain things simply because they are finding themselves dominating the headlines for the wrong reasons. I think there is also a responsibility on journalists. I always sometimes say, you know, Twitter, it's a great platform for interaction, but sometimes it's okay to just let go, especially if you're very confident of the story that you have written. Put it out there. There's no need to be defending yourselves to these nameless Twitter handles that we know are created to just sow that mistrust in the media. And perhaps sometimes there is a thing around politicians dragging you in and hoping for this personal attack, and that takes away from the original story that you've actually written. It's not always easy because we need to come back and say, but these are the facts. But sometimes it's important to just stay away from that personal mudslinging that politicians want to drag you in and make it about eMahlatsi, as opposed to, but what did you do with the money? Was the illegal funds spent on you, etc.? And I think it's we are in a learning curve because social media has advantages and also has disadvantages. The other thing, it speaks to what Zane spoke to around mental health. I mean, I always say to reporters also is that there is a chilling effect when politicians use that social media platform to scare you and try and warn any other reporter who would try to do a story that is very critical of them. Because it's designed that way. It's to say Mahlatsi has written about X and let's go for her so that if there is Zane who's thinking about doing a follow-up, they would think, what would happen to me if I'm gonna have this mob lynching me on social media? Let me then stop. So sometimes I say to my reporters, walk away a little bit, switch off, especially Twitter, just for a long while, allow the story to settle. Let's deal with the facts and avoid as much as you can that personal mudslinging that politicians want to drag us into.
So that speaks into me. How is the product actually changed since COVID? Because now the external context of what's taking place has been put to the fore. That's just taking place before COVID. But Zane, how has the product changed itself?
Lance, just before I talk about that, I just wanted to go back to a point that was made, your original point that you asked about the pandemic and how it's, I think one of the good things that COVID has exposed, like many other things in our society, is that it highlighted the already existing fault lines, not only in society but in the media as well. So the state of our media is not necessarily as a result of COVID now. We know that we've had several issues of credibility and believability and of active participation of non-media groups or non-news groups in the space, working very vehemently in terms of muddying the waters. So what COVID has done in my mind is now provided almost like a perfect cover for a lot of these to continue to entrench themselves in the space, but also it served to highlight the fault lines within our own media industry, right? And so on the product itself, for television, it's crazy. Never 3 months ago, we weren't thinking about accepting a WhatsApp video or voice message as broadcast quality, you know. A lot of that was initiated by the Hudson River plane, if you guys can remember the plane that was landed, right? Then CNN took a decision to accept cell phone footage because they wanted to be first with the footage of this guy saving all these lives on the plane. That changed the game a little bit, but in terms of the purists out there who said you needed a particular camera, you needed particular shots for those things to be broadcast quality. All of those things have been turned on his heads in television broadcasting, because now we are accepting this kind of Zoom and Skype interviews, replacing live studio interviews, replacing live on-the-spot location interviews, that kind of stuff. So not just on a level I think it's impacted the quality of what we do on a number of levels, from the quality of the product to the visual, the quality of the picture, to the quality of the audio, to the quality of the actual story and how we pursue it, like we discussed earlier on, the lack of the doorstop, the lack of the nuance, the lack of proper accountability from newsmakers and those in power. So significantly, it has affected what we do. And I suppose for different mediums, it has a different impact. For radio, it has a particular impact. For television, for print, it has a particular impact. And I think, like I said earlier on, we are still in the maelstrom of the pandemic itself and figuring out how to best adapt. But the impact of what it has had on our industry, I think we'll only be able to really tell 6 months to 18 months to 2 years down the line.
We're going to questions now from the chat. Rob, Neil Johnson asked, with coming to press conferences, old hacks would remember the days when a journal would ask a single question and follow up and a follow-up opportunity. What is with the multiple bunches of questions that never get an answer? He sees this happening at the parliamentary committee as well, where you just get, they take a bunch of questions, blah, 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 and then there's no follow-up, there's no deeper scrutiny. But this has been going on for some time.
I think that this particular period, doing it digitally and remotely, has allowed people to politicians specifically, to not answer these questions. You used to know, if you were in the same room, you could say, you didn't answer this question. But now the MC, the person who's taking the questions, will say, oh, that was answered. That was answered, even though it hasn't been. So it's allowed people to weasel out of answering things they should and avoid responsibility and accountability, and that's been the issue. So you've seen that particular trend happening, I think, for a while. And I think it's because, to some extent, our politicians don't feel themselves accountable to people. I mean, it's a thing where you have to go and talk and you have to do a little thing and explain a little bit, but you don't really feel accountable for explaining what's happening. And I think part of the reason the lockdown has lost so much legitimacy with people is because government hasn't bothered to communicate properly. It looks for the avenues to avoid answering things and explaining things, rather than saying, people are confused about this, we should do more. It's like they don't really care about whether the people accept this lockdown or not, and the reasons for it. There are reasons for things like the alcohol ban. They just haven't bothered to explain it at all, which means that people think it's entirely illegitimate, and then they build conspiracy theories around it, which is that, courses on it, Lamini Zuma's friends are selling tobacco, which, I'm pretty sure isn't true, but because they haven't explained it properly, it creates fertile ground for conspiracies.
Monday Mahuta asks from the chat, the gatekeepers of government, they tend to be blaming a lot of the inefficiencies on COVID-19. But so what they're doing is they're finding an excuse, government or business. Is that true? Do you find that COVID-19 is getting a blame for a lot of things, Mahlatsi?
I think it's certainly given people a reason to come out of something. I mean, we know that often we send questions and they take longer and longer to respond to them, and COVID-19 will be a reason and an answer for it somewhere in between, which obviously it's not always the case. And the one thing I really wanted to also just reflect on is that whole bunch of questions that get asked, and then the politicians answer one or two. It's been one of the things that irritates me for a very long time. And it's not even a thing that comes up with COVID, but it's been something that has built up over the years in South Africa, and we've come to accept it. And I really think it's one of those things that we need to push back on as journalists, and hopefully one day when we do return to being able to have a press conference and say, no, instead of taking 5 questions, can you actually answer my question and allow me to follow up on that question. It's quite critical for accountability. And sometimes it leads to us also telling, incomplete stories, so to speak, because you didn't get an opportunity to ask again. Sometimes the person was answering and mid-sentence was moving on to the next question. So I really think as an industry, we need to be pushing back quite strongly on it. And part of it is also that communicators themselves also don't understand their role. They see themselves just to protect the newsmakers as opposed to actually you have a responsibility to answer, because the journalists are asking questions on behalf of the public, and sometimes, you know, some of them are just glorified bag handlers for ministers or whoever is the business person, as opposed to actually guiding them on the technique of communication. You know, they tend to think that they're doing us favors by allowing politicians especially to speak to us, as opposed to them saying, you have to answer. And also, this is not as something that requires a communicator to answer. Let's use a simple thing. One of the things that's irritating me right now, it's the figures. You know, every night, in the middle of the night, the health department does release the figures. But at that time, there's no opportunity to ask any questions at all. You know, I think we should have had a situation where the health ministry at least once a week speaks to us around those figures so that we contextualize them. I mean, one day you've got death rate, it's like 300 deaths, but you can't give reasons why, you know, what happened. And people, I think, and that's the danger with COVID-19, is that the numbers have become numbers and not necessarily human beings that have died. And I think it's because we're not able to give context. And as media houses, we can't give that context, because between 11 o'clock at night and going to air at 6 o'clock in the morning, who are you going to find to explain that?
Zain, Trevor Neethling asked this question: should we not have like this kind of briefings that Trump has? You know, love him or hate him, is very good at getting his message across. You might not agree with it, you might not like it, but he's prepared to take a robust interview. He's prepared to go and actually at risk being a fool of himself, but he's not saying no to those interviews. But at the same time, let me qualify this, because we do need that kind of robustness. We're all asking for this robust interaction with the newsmakers. But at the same time, are we not going to be setting ourselves up for a sort of lots of entertainment, but really little information what happens with Trump? You know, it'll bring in audience figures, but I don't think that the audience might be necessarily more informed after they leave it. You know, I've seen it with Julius Malema, who's very, very good at communicating, but sometimes he's not held to account. And that's one of the issues that came up. And isn't that what we have if we're going to have these kind of briefings? Isn't that a danger?
It is definitely a danger. And I think, again, COVID-19 is just kind of underlining and highlighting a lot of these issues that were already existing. So I'd like to go back to, it's our responsibility as the media to keep politicians and those in power and newsmakers accountable, irrespective of it's always going to be the job of a politician to try and obfuscate, to try and run away from the questions. In South Africa, we have a particular issue where a lot of the times the ministers aren't equipped enough in terms of the detail, in terms of what is actually going on with the issues. So the content of what we get out of that kind of engagement, right, is very minimal, and the quality of that engagement is reduced by the lack of information, real information that people can use coming out of it. So that is already existing. COVID is just providing a bit of a cover. COVID is providing the perfect opportunity for people to entrench that position. What does that mean for us as media houses? We have to adapt. We have to become innovative in the way that we pursue the information and the facts around certain issues. And that for me has become, it has to be that editorially we workshop the questions. We can't afford anymore to just send reporters and they go there and they ask the questions based on what they think only. It has to be a process where you sit down with your editor and you discuss beforehand the kind of questions, and also realizing that the nature of how these things happen, that you have to be quite succinct, you have to be precise, your questions have to be short and speak to the issue of like a reporter asking 3-4 questions, right? And I think it also needs a broader communication and discussion with government communications, because like Mahlatsi says, I think there is a fundamental problem in the way that they view the media or that they're treating us, in that it's almost like they're doing us favors when we're asking for certain sets of information. It is the responsibility of government to give that information. So, and we need to assert our right to access to that information, you know, and so that in that process we make the gatekeepers to newsmakers, we make them almost obsolete, because it's not a favor. And the way that the South African kind of situation is evolving, unfortunately, they're doing very much the thing that the Americans have done quite successfully, and that is they are almost embracing, they're giving a space to the media where they say, if you are not on the same WhatsApp groups than I am, and the same groups, you don't have access to certain kinds of information. And it muddies the waters for us. And like I said, this was not a problem that's created by COVID, but it's a problem that's created around the world, and particularly in South Africa, where we've had the media or members of the media trying to ingratiate themselves with the power makers or with the power brokers or with the politicians. And I think, yes, we must discuss COVID and the impact, but like I say, these are already existing issues in our media. I think COVID just added another dimension to it. And certainly for us, rather than thinking about how it disadvantages us, we must begin to think as an industry how we can use this to move on to the offensive in terms of the role and responsibility have in the South African context.
Let me put on my hat as a communicator, because we are on the platform of Gravitas. We are a strategic communications company. And one of the things that we have found in specifically when the lockdown was at lockdown level 4, we couldn't get in touch with the newsroom. There were no receptionists. So if I and my colleagues don't have personal relationships where I could phone up a journalist, phoning up a journalist where you don't have access, like you're phoning up a ringing phone. So the safety measures of stretching people out, making them work longer shifts, having fewer people in the building, also has the implication of where a communicator cannot get in touch with you. Isn't this a challenge for you, Rob, when somebody says, well, I've been trying to get in touch with a journalist, and there was nobody there to answer the phone?
Yeah, that's a challenge. But I mean, I do think that to some extent it is easier than ever to get hold of journalists. You can find their email addresses under stories. So you can always email a journalist. And I think most communications companies have those contacts. So I agree that sure, you can't call the newsroom if you're say a general member of the public, but I think that if you've read an article, if you have a sense of how it operates, you have people's email addresses, which I was speaking to a friend from Time magazine, and another journalist was complaining about this, and he was saying, actually, you people complain so much, the modern journalists. Like, it's so much easier for people to contact people. You know, he was from the age before they had cell phones. So he said, we used to have to, use a landline. So, I think that to some extent we don't appreciate how easy these digital channels make it for us, and we don't appreciate that. Just one point, Lance. I mean, you talk about corporate communications companies. I think that communications companies don't do themselves any favors sometimes, because they tell their clients what they want to hear. They tell them that we can keep the message to the message, and the message is often, if the journalist will try and get to the truth, to the bottom of it, but that often conflicts with the very manicured message the communicator wants to get out. So I think the client often expects that the message will come across in a specific way only, but the journalist, that's not their agenda. Their role is to get to the bottom of it, to the truth. So you put out, like Mahlatsi says, you put out these numbers, the COVID numbers. Actually, what you need is an explanation of what this means. You don't just want bland numbers. But, communicators might think, or the minister might think, well, I've done my job, I've put out the numbers. It doesn't illuminate society. It doesn't get to the bottom of things and add truth. And I think sometimes the communicators themselves aren't being open and honest enough with their client to say, actually, the journalist is going to go here. I think there needs to be a better and more direct telling them exactly how it will work, and not allowing them to get out of this.
You're speaking to the choir here, Rob. You're speaking to the choir. But also what I find with COVID, because you've explained that the limitation of resources that you have, and the stretching out of the newsroom. but doesn't that restrict you from covering certain stories? Maklatsi, what's the story that you really want to cover, but conditions won't allow you to? You can pretend that Rob and Zayn aren't listening, and you can give us
I would love to actually be inside a hospital. I think that's the one. I think that's the one story all of us would really like to cover, because, everything we're being told, whether it's the cigarette ban, it's the alcohol ban, all of these things that have a detrimental impact on our economy, we are being told is to actually help the hospitals. I mean, I've been in awe of international news agencies where they've been able to speak to people on ventilators, where you've been able to see what people working in ICU, how they've had to change the way they gear up. And, we just haven't had that opportunity because hospitals are not a place we can access, and no visitors are being allowed. The media is not being allowed. And in a way, we've also even lost the opportunity for good news stories. I mean, the frontline workers, the health workers. I can imagine for any television channel or even radio, or even newspaper, to be able to spend a day in a hospital and tell the stories of these frontline workers and the amazing work that they are doing every single day. I think that's one story that I would really, really like to cover. And it's not necessarily because our reporters are not willing, but it's because of the regulations that government have put in place, and in a way it would actually work for them, because if we want to talk about the bed capacity at a Baragwanath hospital following the weekend, best people to tell that story is the media. They can tell that story for you, and I think the health department has lost on that opportunity. But just also to recap on the relationship between journalists and communicators. I mean, news organizations, newsrooms are becoming smaller and smaller, and that means there's only so much that we're able to do. And I think that's where communicators are going to find it difficult, because on the one hand, they're promising clients that we will get you into the newspaper, we will get you into the radio or television bulletin.
We make no such promises, ever.
But then, as an editor, every single day, I have a difficult balancing act. There are stories that I really want to tell, but I've got less and less people in the newsroom. Then that means some of these stories are really going to fall by the wayside. And I guess for communicators now, more than ever, you would need to have those personal relationships with journalists to be able to push forward why the story matters. Because a lot of the time, communicators think once they've dropped this press release that is beautifully written, perhaps that's about it. But you need to probably have those personal relationships to be able to convince me why it matters, and especially in a time of COVID, when at least 80% of our coverage is around the pandemic and the consequences of that pandemic.
Because Kamini Reddy, she's also raised that issue of what sometimes journalists, I think it's more common, sometimes journalists, the client have her in the middle, and so she's what's got to maintain a relationship with the journalist and at the same time convince the client that it's not going to happen. And so when you pay to deliver good news and you have to deliver bad, sometimes it's a nasty tightrope that you have to run. The same thing goes for with what Trevor was asking for. How would you guys rate, Rob? How would you guys rate the standard of South African corporate communications in South Africa, and specifically when coming to COVID? COVID has put a lot of pressure on communicators around the world, and some companies that weren't seen as public facing are now forced into being public facing companies, because you deal with them in business.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it varies greatly. It varies greatly between the guys who are smart, who use their relationships, who understand how things work, and then I think that there are people who aren't at that level, who just send press releases, who don't communicate very well, who don't understand the importance of, don't understand how the media operates. So I think there's, it varies tremendously, and there's some great, it's the same as media. There's some great things going down and some very bad things. And it's very inconsistent. I mean, I think that a lot of the communicators, sure, they get caught in the middle, but I think that if they understand what the journalist wants, which is basically to get to the bottom of something, you can't protect your clients from something like that. And I think Perhaps some communicators are worried about losing business by telling clients that this is what's going to happen. But if you have a story to tell and you're not getting to the bottom of it, well, then it's not going to come out like the client wants anyway. So it compromises that relationship.
My biggest frustrations, just to jump in there, is when there's a good story and we also want to tell it, but the communicators can't allow us to tell it the way we want. And I'll give an example. So company says we are investing so many millions in building ventilators in South Africa. And I say, can we go to the factory? That's how we want to tell the story. Oh no, you can't go to the factory, COVID, regulate. And then I'm like, then I don't want to just do an announcement about you spending money and investing in ventilators. The way to tell it for me, I'm thinking from a radio or even a visually, is actually being in the factory and actually speaking to the ordinary people that are building these ventilators, perhaps. What does it mean for them? And that's how I want to tell the story. And I think communicators sometimes lose that because in their minds, it's the CEO who must be telling this good news story about this multi-million rand investment, but the story could be told similarly but more beautifully without just the talking head.
Can I just add one thing to that? Edwin just asked a great question, which is that should storytelling not be a greater part of it? And I think that is fundamental. You look at some of the great US newspapers, great US media platforms, and they tell stories of people's lives. And I think that we often are very used to bland press releases that speak about generic things that are ultimately uninteresting. I think we use storytelling more, explain how this impacts people's lives. You form a media connection. I think that's where our media needs to move to. And I think a lot of the overseas media have moved to a greater extent towards storytelling as a way of explaining the generic wider issues. And I think that's something we should do more. It captures their imagination. And certainly I think communicators could do that. You saw that very well in the situation with
that's exactly.
Well, the insurance companies not paying out for liability claims, Santam and those insurers. And I think that Claims Africa, which was the organization fighting Santam and Hollard and all of these guys, they had a couple of great examples of, say, the Drakensberg Sun or the Cathedral Peak in Drakensberg. Telling those individual stories showed why it mattered to individual people. Yes. And COVID is a chance to show why these things matter to individual people rather than generic statements.
That's exactly what Edwin Raidu was raising in the comment section as well, saying that they use an opportunity. Marcel Gordon goes on to ask, how are newsrooms dealing with so-called COVID fatigue, both for the consumers and their staff? You know, sometimes I just go, COVID, how many deaths? The numbers don't matter to me anymore. It really doesn't. You know, whether it's 10, 15 infections, it doesn't matter because it's just a number to me. It's not telling me anything. Sorry? Zain, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think just to add on to the point that Rob was making about that is what we're trying to do at Newsroom is to focus on the human interest stories and tell the impact and the consequences of COVID-19 through the eyes of ordinary people. Tell the story of the family who's lost a loved one and was not able to see that loved one before they died. Or the family, the Muslim family, who had to bury, go and bury their parents or their loved ones without being able to tell stories, the human interest story that I think is lacking at the moment, and is the kind of story that will bring about a deeper understanding of the impact of COVID-19. The other big story I think that is out there is obviously the corruption issue. And as we've spoken about how communicators are either blocking or how politicians are deliberately avoiding and obfuscating us getting to the facts. Those are the stories that people want to hear, because I think there is a great sense that whilst we are suffering and while people are living through the effects of COVID-19, there seems to be a complete detachment from leaders, both in their actions. So like we've seen, for instance, the issue with the ANC leaders around Andrew Langeni's funeral, where no social distancing was observed. It's like we're living in two different parallel universes, right? And also some of the initial pictures and stories that we've heard about high-ranking officials of the state and how they got COVID and what they're doing. It serves to almost entrench that picture that if you are of a certain class, if you are of a certain vocation in life, if you are a politician and belong to certain political parties, you are almost immune to the effects and consequences of COVID-19. And I think that's the kind of story, the contrast of life in South Africa at the moment that we should be telling.
And I think the one around fatigue is one that we all worry about in our newsrooms, because it's been, you know, we started reporting on this disease somewhere in December as a very distant disease somewhere in Asia. And it was only in March that it became part of our households. But we do know that South Africans are also people that tend to move on quite quickly. And the one thing that we struggled with, we worried about, was fatigue, like people no longer reading the stories. Fortunately, so far, we can say we are not experiencing that as yet, because when we look at the numbers, especially the ones that we can track online, we're still continuing to see a surge in people reading COVID-related stories. But I think you're right, the fatigue will set in. For the staff members, it's quite a real concern, because it's not only the fatigue of telling probably the story with one core thing, which is the pandemic itself. It can have different layers and different angles, but at the end of it, it is still very related to COVID. It's around trying to continuously telling our reporters that, yes, it is not just the story, it's not just one story, but it's a story of COVID with very different layers. And you have to reemphasize that, but also equally that thing that Zane talked about, the mental care of our reporters, that has been quite critical. And you have to, every day, be very much aware of their own circumstances. I mean, working from home is not as luxurious as people make it out to be. Some of us leave our homes because we are running away. You know, we want a break from the home. You've got kids that are doing online learning. You've got babies that don't understand that even though you're physically in the house, you are actually working. Your parents who are popping up in your Zoom meetings, etc. And that mental state is quite a real thing for our reporters. And what we have tried to do is be very aware. We're trying to do as many one-on-ones with the reporters as possible, just to debrief, but also allowing for the wellness caregivers to be available to them, and reemphasize that reporters don't always go out there seeking for help. So you kind of have to tell them every single day that, you know, it's okay to debrief, and please go and debrief. And if possible, jump on the opportunity to tell a story that is not COVID related.
In terms of the fatigue, in terms of the fatigue, Lance, sorry, just to jump in there. Earlier in the week, I was presenting the diary at our newsroom, and afterwards they said, guys, Zain, but this diary looked like an FBOB advert, you know, because it's just death, and COVID and suffering. And so there is a real challenge also for us in newsrooms to what you guys know, what we call color and shade the bulletins. Unfortunately, even getting to those stories becomes more and more difficult, as you know, as the issue of fatigue sets in, as we have to deal with hours and at a certain time having to take off, and you're actually having to give people a little bit of a break, because you have to be understanding and show empathy in terms of the lengths that people have gone to actually just cope under these, because at the same time that we are facing COVID-19 and the impact on one level on broadcasters, for us in the media, in television news, it's also been a very strategic moment, in the sense that we've never had so much eyeballs on the screen. And so we've also had to take the opportunity of this strategic moment to do a lot more. And so we've asked a lot more of people. Often at the expense, it's a strategic time for businesses to, especially in the broadcasting medium, to gain a market share, to extend your footprint, to do what it is we do in this business. So it's a double-edged sword almost. And it's something that as managers of in this environment.
I just want to jump in over here. You raised the issue of eyeballs, and now I've gone through that SANEF report into the impact of COVID. For people who want to go through to that, we'll post it on our Gravitas webpage and also post it in the later on. Also, you can go to the SANEF webpage. And there are some interesting things that I want to do because we're running out of time, so I'm looking for short answers. First of all, the magazines are in real trouble. So, Rob, we're holding thumbs for you because we saw like massive. They were shutting down. We have seen increased eyeballs on digital platforms and on the broadcasters, but no money is gone there. So you literally see that Zulu News has gone up by 70% on SABC, the viewing of Zulu News, that News 24 and IOL and Eyewitness News and Business Live and Media and MoneyWeb, their readership has shot through the ceiling, but there's no money going onto these platforms. Are you scared about the business modeling? How sustainable is this? Let's go keep short answers, Maklatsi. Are you worried?
Very, very worried. The money is just not following the viewers, and I don't know, and that's why we are seeing all of these retrenchments across the media industry. And by all indications, if this economy does not pick up, it's only going to get worse. And that has serious implications in terms of holding those in power accountable and actually telling the South African story.
Can I add to that?
Go ahead.
Lance, I mean, I think that the business model is difficult, and I think it's been all across the world. And here, I think we've got a smaller audience, and I think it's more pressing here. Advertisers have also not come to the party here, so that's why a lot of publications have closed down. I mean, like you say, online has been fantastic, but it hasn't brought the sense that people are aware they need to pay for news, which is why I think it's encouraging that News 24 is now putting up a paywall. Our Business Live paywall is working pretty well. And I think Daily Maverick's starting a newspaper now. So I think it's a good thing that's changed the mindset that people have to, these are journalists who bring you the news. They need to get a salary. The perception that, we don't need news because we get all our news from Twitter is like farms. I buy all my food from the supermarket. It's just ridiculous. So, I mean, the fact is it's a good thing that people are sensitized towards paying for news. The very people who you see on Twitter saying, I don't read the mainstream news, are responding to mainstream news articles. So the greater perception that people rely on the news and they do need the news is a good thing. Ryk van Niekerk wrote something on MoneyWeb this week where he said to the companies, you need to be more aware of how you need to play a role in supporting journalism and think about it. And I think that's important to do. We need to all think about the people who say, where were the journalists when something happens? Well, the journalists are largely out of work over the last 10 years. So we need to rethink how we support them in this scenario. And if we want a strong, accountable democracy, this is what we need to do.
Zane, are you also counting the ad breaks on TV just to make sure that the salaries get paid?
Like I said, if you watch television screens, I think it's, like I say, it's the impact of COVID-19 is quite different for different mediums of media at the moment. I'd like to think that the TV broadcasters necessarily come to the party, but I think some advertisers have noticed the strategic moment, at least in terms of television stations.
So Zane has said it, that if you're looking for a job, you can go to Newsroom Africa. They're making money. It's fine on their side.
they share it.
I just want to say thank you so much for your time. You know, you're having three journalists in the country, being very frank, being very honest. So there are some questions that we just couldn't get to. So I'm just going to apologize to the people that we couldn't get your questions. But it's an hour that went very, very quickly in terms of what we want. This is the first of our chats in terms of where the media is going. We're looking next time to get the media owners on to ask them about their business modeling, because there's some serious challenges taking place, and we need to understand from them what are they going to be investing in. We've seen some cutbacks taking place across the board. 40% of between 30 and 40% of KFM's staff was cut before the lockdown. There's challenges there's retrenchments taking place at Prime Media. There's still talk of retrenchments taking place at SABC. So for all the people who like to complain, understand that there are some serious challenges taking place, and people are really struggling at the moment. Thank you once again for all your participation. My heart goes out to all those people that have to work under trying circumstances to bring us the news. Thank you very much.